Assalamu alaikum, dear viewers. Welcome to another episode of Mindful Meeting Podcast. I'm your host, King Abu. Alhamdulillah, today we are making history because we are actually talking about an Imam from Ali Muhammad. For the first time on this podcast, and inshallah, it's going to continue to be an annual thing, just like we do for the heroes of Karbala and Imam Zaman. And this Imam is unfortunately, the forgotten Imam, the neglected, the lonely Imam, Imam al-Hasan al-Mujtaba, the pride and joy of Fatima al-Zahra, salawatullah wa salamu alayhima. Joining me today is going to be a special guest, who I'll introduce in a little bit, but I wanted to explain the format for today, because typically, as you know, when we honor any member of the Ma'sumin, we typically just focus on their lives and their legacies, and we celebrate that, right? And so an idea occurred to me, and I thought, why not pick a topic and dissect that topic, inshallah, and celebrate the lives and the legacies of these Ma'sumin personalities. So inshallah today, we're going to honor Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam and talk about a topic that I think is very relevant in the Muslim world today, a topic that's sensitive and considered taboo in many Muslim circles. But inshallah, before we get to that, I want to take this opportunity to once again thank my wife and show my great sincere appreciation and gratitude for the decorations here that she put together that you see behind me. Although I'm starting to think she's using my podcast as a platform now, as a marketing platform, and I think we should start charging her. That might be a fiqh issue, so I'm going to ask our dear guest later on if a husband can charge his wife. Well, we'll get to that in a second. I'm just kidding. But before we get started, let's go ahead and make a du'as as we always do for our brothers and sisters in Palestine and for all the Muslim men around the Muslim Ummah. And joining me to recite that du'a for us is our dear guest, Sayyidina. Please honor us with the du'a for our brothers.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Assalamu alaikum to all the respected viewers, and of course we begin this episode with heavy hearts, knowing what is still happening in the occupied territories of Palestine, both in Gaza, where close to 2 million people have been displaced, 30,000 people have been killed, innocent civilians, and in the occupied West Bank, where individual Muslim families are still being evicted from their homes for no reason other than they are not of the required religious group and required religious denomination. And so for that, we express a lot of sorrow and grief. It's very sad to see these images of children, families being evicted from their homes, being sent away, as well as those in Gaza who, in addition to now having been killed in these recent months, the ones who are remaining are now suffering intolerable conditions of starvation, famine, and just overall difficulty, where there's a lack of access to resources, and the authorities have not allowed in the necessary aid to reach those people. And so these people are scraping by with whatever they have. And so it is important that we begin with a short prayer for the success of these people. Again, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Ya Allah, by the right of Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad, we pray that all the Mazlum Mu'mineen and Mu'minat who are oppressed in Palestine, as well as other places in the world, are granted relief. We pray that those families who are suffering from famine, from lack of rizq, and from emotional fatigue are given plenteous rizq and copious rizq as soon as possible. We pray for justice for those families who have lost loved ones during these heinous attacks in the last few months. And we pray for sabr and jameel, for beautiful patience for those families that are still surviving and that have to deal with the loss of breadwinners, relatives, family members, etc. during this difficult time. And lastly, we pray that we as a Muslim Ummah can do more to help these people not face this kind of tragedy, or help any oppressed people not face this kind of tragedy anywhere in the world. And we pray that especially that people realize the importance of a Masoom Imam, and that we can work and pray and act in his absence just as we would in his appearance. وَالْآخِرَ دَعْوَانَا أَنِ الْحَمْدُ لِلَّهِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ.
Thank you so much for that dua. It was really heartfelt. Sabr Jameel, indeed. They really need that. And Allah, inshallah, will grant them. So with that said, before we begin, I have a riddle for you.
Sure.
Specifically chose this one because it's got a legal component to it, and that being a background. We'll talk about that in a second. And I think it's somewhat related to our topic. So here we go. Is it legal for a man to marry his widow's sister?
For a man to marry his widow's sister? Well, clearly, I mean, so I guess we have to define which law we're talking about, right? But in American law, of course, there's obviously no problem with that, right? If you have a widow and then you marry her sister, there would be no prohibition on that. But then also within Islamic law, right, once a woman has passed away, then it would be permitted as well to marry her sister.
Are you sure about that?
I think so.
Okay, listen to this side. Careful. Is it legal for a man to marry his widow's sister? I'll just
His
give you a clue.
deceased.
Yes, there we go.
Deceased wife. Oh, I see.
So he's a dead man.
Oh, I see.
He can marry anyone.
So his own, you're saying once he's passed away.
Yes.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
the
I mean,
widow is referring to his wife.
Is himself. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Gotcha. All right.
Yeah, they try to trick you.
I didn't get you that enough.
No, you
But
didn't
thank
get
you.
it, kid.
That's why it's a riddle.
Yes, it is, exactly. So, dear viewers, so we have a special guest today, very decorated and dedicated Muslim servant of Allah, inshallah. His name is Sayyid Shaan Rizvi, correct? I was confused if it was Abbas or Rizvi.
Either one.
Thank you. Sayyid Shaan Rizvi. He grew up in upstate New York, where he got a law degree and practiced law for several years before he went to study at the Ahlul Bayt Islamic Seminary in Chicago, Illinois, to further his studies in traditional Islamic seminary curriculum. He then, after that, he pursued his higher levels of Islamic studies, studying tafsir of the Quran and Akhlaq in the city of Qom in Iran. He is now serving as the Director of Religious Education at the Hadith School of Accelerative Learning. MashaAllah, very impressive. Firstly, on behalf of Mindful Media Podcast and myself, Eid Wiladat Mubarak to you on the auspicious occasion of the birth anniversary of Imam Hassan.
Eid Mubarak to you,
Thank
to all
you.
the viewers
To all, exactly.
who are watching at home. It's one of the times of special barakah and blessing because we are in the holy month. And on top of that, we are at the midway point of the holy month, and we are commemorating, one of the five, noble, individuals that are mentioned, through various narrations, various ahadith. As you said, he is one of the forgotten imams, and so, this is an individual who, according to some narrations, he gave away the entirety of his wealth in the way of Islam, right? And that is interesting because it has a kind of a tie to Ramadan, where he's giving, Ramadan has a connection to charity. And so Imam Hassan is, according to some narrations, he gave out the entirety of what he owned 2 times, right? Fi sabilillah.
Subhanallah.
And so that's difficult for us to conceive of because most of us, cannot do that, and nor should we do that because, the maqam of Ahlul Bayt, the status is very different than you and I, right? So I'm not encouraging us to do that, but at the same time, it's good to see that we have these role models of generosity and virtue who we strive to follow.
Wow, there was something interesting you said, very baffling to me, and that's a discussion for another episode for sure. But I just want to touch on it because the wealth of Al Muhammad was something that always fascinated me because it's always presented as Ahlul Bayt had nothing. Right? They were just meek and very poor people. there are even narrations that may mention that Imam Hassan was shivering due to hunger and whatnot, and it makes you wonder, like, what did Amir al-Mu'mineen not work or provide for his family? Like, where was their money and all that stuff? But that's a discussion for another day. But it shows to me that twice you mentioned that he gave away his wealth, meaning that he had wealth to give away in the first place.
Of course.
SubhanAllah.
Yeah, so it wasn't negligible. I mean, there was something that he was giving.
Ahsan, ahsan.
And clearly, if we do look at the lives of the later Imams, we do know that wealth was part of their lives, right? And there's always a distinction between acquiring wealth and being attached to that wealth, right?
Ahsan.
And so we see that in the lives of Ahlul Bayt, especially with Amir al-Mu'mineen, and the power he had as the Khalifa of the Muslim world, access to wealth, both personal, right, and public wealth that he had access to, yet he lived a very simple, meager life, right? And that kind of shows you that the issue wasn't that he was not able to earn, it's that he chose to live voluntarily a certain way because that allowed him to connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala better.
So, speaking of wealth, I'm sure you spent a lot of money and put a lot of time and effort into your career path. And I'm sure you chose that path because it was something you were passionate about, you enjoyed doing. When I hear stories like you, ulama or scholars who choose a career path and then venture out of it and venture into Islamic studies, I'm always curious and fascinated by, maybe I have the wrong perception that gave you more money than what you're doing right now. I don't know if it's true or not.
That part is true.
That part is true, right?
Right.
So I guess my assumption was correct.
Yes.
So then my question is, what was the motivation? Why did you leave the law career to pursue Islamic studies?
Yeah, I guess there's two different things I could mention. One is that I think I always had a desire to do attraction towards religion from a young age.
Sure.
And so that stayed with me as I got older and in university. I think as I was considering what career path to choose, my parents were very insistent that I do something that would allow me to have a solid career in case, I decided to discontinue the study of religion or if I wasn't able to support myself through it. And so partially at their insistence, partially because I also was interested in law, but to respect their desires, I decided to pursue a law degree and then practice for several years as well. And I thought the reasoning was sound that in case I wasn't able to support myself through religious work, that I would have another profession, right? So that was one part of it. I think another part I can mention is that as I was practicing as an attorney, there were times when I considered, should I just stay in this field? But the more I looked at the needs of the community and really the world around us, right, I realized that there are plenty of lawyers, plenty of people who are, making a lot of money and able to donate to the masajid. But I do feel that the problems that our world is experiencing at this moment in time are spiritual, right, and psychological and family related, right? And so I thought that there was much more of a need for people to be in this realm. And so that was why I thought it was necessary for me to pursue this, and it was something I was interested in. And so I said, Bismillah. So I practiced law for about after I graduated, I practiced for about 3.5 years. And I was practicing in the field of employment and labor law. And are you speaking of lessons for people who would seek to be lawyers or just general? Yes. Okay. So lessons for people who would like to go into that field. I think it is it's certainly a profitable field, right? There's a lot of, especially being in America, because it is a land of, as you know, regulations and laws. And so therefore you need attorneys and lawyers for a lot of things, right? And so therefore there's a lot of scope to do well and make money. I think as a Muslim, it can be a challenging field. Because so a couple of things. One is that especially the attorneys who are making kind of on the higher end of the income bracket, they tend to be working a lot of hours. And it's a very stressful lifestyle. Again, if you're aiming for those top of the line type of positions. I think a second challenge is that in the legal system as it works, you're supposed to represent one side, as diligently and thoroughly as possible. Well, that often leads to bending the law, bending things to your interest, to your favor. Yes. And of course, as lawyers, you do have an ethical duty to be honest. Sure. But the line between honesty and dishonesty, there's a lot of gray there, and that is the gray is where the lawyers operate, right? And so, as an attorney, there's sort of an incentive to sometimes be dishonest, right? Or not completely honest. And that, I think, over time can wear down on a person's psyche and soul.
For sure, for sure. Awesome.
Jazakallah.
Yeah, may Allah add more barakah for you in that decision.
Jazakallah.
This, my friends, is yet another example of why everything is not about money. It's about nobility and dignity and doing what Allah calls you to do. I just realized that as I was explaining how we changed the format about celebrating the legacies of the Ahlul Bayt personalities, but I haven't even introduced the topic. I just realized. So before we go jump into that, today we want to talk about the root causes of divorce and how to prevent them, because it's a really sad epidemic that's going on in the Muslim world. The divorce rates is skyrocketing, and in my personal opinion, I believe it's because lack of preparation for marriage, lack of premarital counseling, all of these things combined is what eventually leads up to divorce, and not teaching the couple beforehand conflict resolution skills, right? Because conflicts will arise in every marriage. So today we are gathered here to discuss that topic, and a lot of our questions are it's gonna revolve around one specific ayah from the Noble Quran, and I want to actually read it accurately. It's chapter 4, verse 35. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, if you anticipate a split between them, yani the wife and the husband, appoint a mediator from his family and another from hers. If they desire reconciliation, Allah will restore harmony between them. Surely Allah is all knowing, all aware. So, I guess my first question is this statement. It seems to me when I read this verse, at least from my limited understanding, is that Allah seems to be promising the solution, so to speak. The caveat being if the couple wants that resolution, right? So, in light of that, is there ever a time then for divorce?
Yeah, absolutely. Very good question. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So now that we're shifting to this topic, right?
Yeah.
Which, as you said, is it's a difficult topic to speak about. And of course, we can't speak about divorce without speaking about marriage as well, right? And so we'll be talking about both, I think, through our questions.
Sure.
I know you had a session with Maulana Farhad Abbas where he focused on marriage.
And we talked about those things.
And you talked about divorce as well, right? So you clearly can't talk about one without the other. So, but yes, to answer your question, clearly we know from both the ayat of the Holy Quran and the narrations that we have from the Ahlul Bayt that divorce is something that exists within the Muslim community and within Islam, we should say, and it should exist, right? Because there has to be, it cannot be such that there is a binding contract between two people for the remainder of their lives, which unfortunately is seen in some other religious traditions, right? That divorce has kind of the status of hurma, like it's haram on them to divorce, right? Which Islam has never advocated, nor does that ayah, right? So with that said, what we can say as a general matter is that absolutely there is a place and time for divorce, but the question becomes when and under what circumstances, the million-dollar question. Right? Again, I'm speaking in terms of general principles, right? And not in terms of specific situations. Right. But in terms of general principles, one thing we can say is that the narrations that mention, divorce being a hated thing or one of the most hated things or the most hated thing in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, other narrations which we don't have to go into. But what we can gather from all this is that, and in the words of scholars who've worked in this area, as I've kind of, in my studies, I poked around and asked and have spoken to kind of senior scholars about this issue, and the unanimous sort of view that is presented, right, is that divorce should be considered as a last resort, right? And that it means that when you have tried everything else, right, to resolve the marital disputes, whether they be emotional, psychological, physical, whatever the issues are, religious, right? And that entails, for example, talking to the other person. That may entail getting the other person's family involved, as the ayah indicates. That may entail that should entail seeking the advice of a scholar and or a marriage counseling, right? And that marriage counseling does not have to be necessarily from an Islamic scholar. It could be from a licensed marriage counselor, right? But going through all those steps, right, and really spending time trying to work on it, such that, okay, at the end of it, if those differences are really irreconcilable, then it would be appropriate to consider that as an option. Now, what are irreconcilable differences is a bigger question, is another question, right? And I think sometimes we think differences are irreconcilable when they're really not, right? So, for example, a personality difference, maybe not a good reason to get a divorce, right? Maybe you don't get along with the family of your spouse, okay? Somewhat common, but not a great reason to pursue divorcing the spouse, right? Maybe you have a difference of opinion about what school to send your children to, right? So these are all secondary concerns that I don't think should be cause for irreconcilable differences leading to divorce. What we can say is that if there are one of the red lines of marriage is if the religious boundaries are not upheld and respected. So, for example, if a husband has an obligation to do something for his wife, such as to provide for her, and he's not able to, but he's also not willing to embark on that, right, and take that obligation seriously, and the wife and the family are suffering as a result, right, and that they've gone through the steps of mediation and working with family and counselors, and he's still not willing to do that or does not take that seriously, then that is a Shari'i red line where the woman would be justified, in my understanding, to consider divorce as an option at that point. And likewise, we can point to other examples for the man, right? Or generally, our religious sensibilities and religious red lines can be valid grounds for pursuing divorce. Again, assuming that you've gone through the steps and you consider that as the last option, last resort.
Awesome. Now, this verse has I have a personal relation with this verse.
Okay.
It's like one of the verses I consider home.
Okay.
Because of the context that I'm going to provide. I got married in 2008, divorced 2017, and that period of 2017 to like end of 2018, it was one of the darkest moments of my life.
Okay.
And normally divorce, just happens, you move on.
Yes.
But it's just how you go about the divorce and how people treat you and stuff like that. So for me, it's a merry occasion, and we're celebrating the Wiladat of Imam Hassan, but it was a very tough time, right? Because even the ulama I went to seek counseling guidance from, because they are leaders at the end of the day, right? They are a source of, they are role models, we look up to them, they have the knowledge we don't, So I went to them, and the only thing I would get was, have you become shaitan yourself? Why listen to shaitan? Divorce. Allah hates divorce and this and this and leaders in the community and So it just it kind of trickled down to the community members, to family members, to the point that I became so isolated.
I see.
Saying that I even hated myself. I was angry at Allah. I lost respect and trust in the ulama. And I flirted with not only living Islam altogether, but ending my life. I really believed that nobody loved me, cared about me. And it was at that moment that I said, let me see what Quran says about divorce. And as I was looking into it, I came across this ayah. And what stands out to me is when Allah says, if they want to reconcile their differences, Allah will give them the solution, the harmony, the peace. I couldn't find that. I see in the Muslim world, it's like a common theme, the guilt tripping, the spiritual manipulation. So, you refer to this verse and it's the opposite of what we do. Allah doesn't treat us that way. He doesn't make us feel worthless and all of these things. So how do we go around that? How do we come to this point that we've stigmatized divorce to this level?
Yeah. Well, that's a very good question, right? And, one thing that it's really important to keep in mind here is that our conception of being in a marriage, if we zoom out a little bit, might not be correct. Which is that sometimes in the West we think of, we think once we've gone through the steps to find a proper married partner, right? She's a match for us. She's religiously a match, family match, personality match. Then our lives should be good, right? They should be happy, right? We should get along well. Oftentimes that's not the case, right? And as we see with, for example, the noble prophet, he didn't have that relationship with all of his wives, right? Or we can see with Prophet Nuh alayhi salam that his wife wasn't a mu'minah, right? When at the end of her life.
Yeah.
So I guess what we fail to realize is that marriage can definitely be, for a mu'min person, it can be their most serious test, right? Most difficult test could be marriage, right? And part of that test, in fact, may also be divorce, right? That because divorce is a halal thing, it might also be part of that same test. But once we condition ourselves to think that nothing can go wrong, we're kind of setting ourselves up. And I think that goes back to perhaps a lack of training, as you said, but lack of understanding and building that resilience in our children, that even if they are madhabi, if they're the religious, right, that part of your religiosity will be, maybe this woman will be a test, or I should say man or woman, will be a test for you in some way, right? And your iman will really be tested through this marriage, right? So meaning, I don't think we can think of it as every mu'min is going to have a very rosy marriage.
Right, for
right?
sure.
And so I think that is some of what causes this difficulty, I think, that we're referring to. So I think a couple of things, reminding ourselves, to zoom back on your question, reminding ourselves of the examples of, right, very pious individuals, whether they be prophets, who struggled with their own marriages, right? And another example, another thing to keep in mind is just that, the divine test can manifest in so many forms. It may manifest through that divorce may itself be part of the plan and may be part of your divine test. So I think once we disconnect it and say that Allah didn't want this, well, we can't say that, right? Because clearly, if it's permitted in fiqh, then we can say that at some level, in some circumstances, that sometimes it was wanted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That was the right decision.
Wow.
Right? And again, as we alluded to, if someone is forcing you to, one example I gave where I think divorce may be considered appropriate is if someone's red lines for religious practice are not respected, right? And so in those cases, it may be the right decision, right? Stigma is another issue, which we'll talk about. So the community stigma and the societal stigma.
Yeah, let's talk about that because I struggle with that as a man. And, we live in a world where men are not allowed to express any feelings or emotions, and we're not expected to be humans, like we're robots, like you don't have feelings or anything, because the moment you open your mouth, you are labeled as weak man and everything. It's a safe world for women to express herself, right? So if I felt that way to that level of flirting with suicide, yeah, I can only imagine what our sisters are go through, right? When they go through the divorce, or maybe their husband dies or something like that, and the whole community stigmatizes them. How do we? I know it's not. I'm being rosy right now, trying to hook up to stop that. It's probably not going to happen 100%, but how can we improve that?
Yeah. So first of all, I'm glad that you shared your personal story. I really appreciate you sharing that because I think we learn from each other, right? And personal experiences sometimes in the Muslim community are hard to share. So I appreciate you sharing that and getting your insights from that experience, what you got out of it. But to go back to your question, I think the stigma issue is a really difficult one because on one hand, we want people to respect the centrality and the sacredness of marriage. And so therefore, if we put marriage on this pedestal and say that this is such an important thing in the deen and we should strive for it and work on it and, it's a holy union, which it is. Naturally, that will also lead to, if someone breaks that, right, there will be a natural stigma there. Right? Now, that doesn't take into account, and I think to some extent, we do want people to still keep in mind that to have this conception of marriage as a holy relationship, right? Fi sabilillah, that you've engaged in, and to consider that divorce should be a last option for you, not the third or fourth or fifth option, right? After you've gone through all the steps.
Right.
So naturally, I think, and what that does is that will create a mental barrier, I think, for someone who's considering these options, at least to kind of really think through, have they thought about all the consequences of this decision? With that being said, the stigma is sometimes unfair because, as we said, sometimes the marriage was it was a good idea to break it.
Yeah.
Right? So in those cases, the stigma is unfair.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a little bit of lack of precision, right?
Oh,
Where the
that
people
makes
are
sense,
thinking
yeah.
about divorce as, oh, it was always bad. Well, no, that's not the case. Sometimes divorce was the right decision, right? And so I think as a community, the onus is on us to become two things. One is just more educated about this fact that divorce is not always bad. There are relationships where it could be the right decision, and to accept that
Hard
and
ways.
talk about that from the minbar,
Yeah.
right? But
Well,
number two, and that's a
from the
sticky, that's a sticky topic, right? Yeah, I'm sure if I do that, you won't be seeing me again after that. But number two, also, so how do we reintegrate those who have been divorced back into the fold, right?
Yeah.
And that means encouraging, helping them get married again,
Oh,
right?
right.
And then trying to find spouses for them, and kind of realizing that this person is probably in a vulnerable state, right? Especially soon after they get divorced for the first few years.
Yeah.
Really reaching out to them. As you said, you don't know what that person is going through because of that unfair stigma. They're probably taking that pressure on themselves. So accommodating them, reaching out to them, and then helping them, get back on their feet, whether it's financially or trying to find a new spouse once they're ready. Because the sooner they can get remarried, the better. Sooner that stigma also goes away, and they should try to get remarried if they can. So there's a lot there. Yeah, I don't think that stigma will ever go away completely.
Probably not.
Right, but at the same time, and there's an aspect of the stigma which can be good, in that it discourages certain divorces, right? So there's a part of it that's good, but there's another part that's unfair.
Yes.
But what I do see in the younger generation is that a lot of youth, I find, are more and more willing to consider, not look down upon someone for being divorced, and to even consider marrying those people again, right? Both for men and women, I've seen that they're very kind of becoming open-minded to that possibility, and saying that you are not any lesser of a person, and you're, who you are today, and what your past doesn't define who you are. Right. And all these ideas. So I think that tide is changing a little bit.
Alhamdulillah. It's one of the reasons I love doing this podcast, because I get to talk to people, broaden my horizons, get me out of my little bubble in my box. Teaches me to see things from a different perspective. And, when I hear sisters sharing their stories with me of they would never leave their marriage despite the physical abuse, the torment, the psychological bullying, because for them, they rather tolerate that than how the community will chastise them. It's too painful, SubhanAllah. But you're right, because we can become a society that glorifies divorce. Right, so the stigma, I see what you're saying. A little bit of it is good. Yeah. It kind of keeps us in check, right? Right. Because we don't want to just, we had an argument, let's divorce, let's start. We don't want that. We don't want to condone that. So that is the society we live in, with these movements like the feminist movement that encourage that at the first sight of a small, even a very minute problem, oh, he said that to you, leave it. Or she said that to you, leave her. Right. How do we counter this and create that balance and safeguarding our marriages? Yeah,
that's a very good point. Well, you remind me of the famous website Reddit, which I'm sure you've heard of. And there's forums dedicated where people ask these kinds of questions, and then they get advice. They say something happened with their wife or their husband, and then the users advise them. But in the process of advising them, they often advise them to leave the marriage or stay in the marriage, but be careful of this, right? And this is all dangerous, right? Yeah. Because ultimately, we don't want people to think of that. And I remember another story where I was talking to someone in law school, an attorney, and he was saying, in our house, we don't mention the D word. which is the divorce, right? Which is an interesting way to look at it as well, that this is kind of a word that I'm not going to throw around. If I'm in an argument with my wife, I'm just going to be like, okay, that's it,
Yeah, you're divorced. I'm going to divorce you.
Yeah, or like, I'm going to divorce you. Like, like it's not a joke, right? And that can really have a powerful, like, very hurtful effect on someone if you say that in the heat of a fight, right? Like,
That's a threat.
It's a threat, and it really will hurt them. Like, make them feel very uncomfortable in the relationship, right? And I'm sorry, your initial question was, given these kind of movements, what can we do?
Yeah, how can we safeguard our marriages?
Yeah, so that's a very good, and of course, this is the part where we're going to touch on marriage a little bit. But
for sure.
I think thinking outside the box a little bit. I'd be interested in your kind of feedback on some of these ideas as well, if you have some thoughts on this. But of course, like, marital counseling and being ready for marriage is necessary. When we talk about getting children ready for marriage, there's a couple of points. I think we have to give them, like, we can look at it as positive preparation and negative preparation. So the positive preparation would be giving them the taqwa that they need, right? Character that they need to be able to be resilient, right, in the face of difficulty, to not react at small things, to plan out their day, and to really have that control of themselves. Right? In addition to that, positive preparation is also giving them life skills, because I find that a lot of people in the Muslim community, unfortunately, we're lacking in a lot of the life skills that we really need, whether it's being physically active, being able to have a conversation with someone, right? Not being socially awkward, being able to have good organization and time management skills, right? Being healthy in our diet and all kinds of things like that. Being able to read body language, right? A lot of these social and emotional skills are also necessary in a marriage, right? And I think we don't train our children in those aspects, right? We think about deen. We've kind of limited deen to, right, just these 3 or 4 or 5 things, right? And the muttaqi person is the one who's gone on the most ziyarat and umrah, and the one who goes to Dua Kumail every Thursday, but we don't look at these other things as muttaqi, right? And so I think that mentality needs to change a little bit, right? And so that's kind of the positive preparation. The negative preparation is, as we alluded to earlier, maybe getting our children ready for this idea that you don't know where life will take you, right? Maybe your spouse is not going to be compatible. Maybe she's compatible now, but in 5 years or 10 years, like, she'll turn into this very difficult person, right? And so, are you going to be able to have the taqwa and the strength of character to be able to be resilient and that and work through your issues, right? And go through those steps of kind of trying to save your marriage and work on your marriage, and or, like, be willing to get to the point of divorce and deal with that divorce if it comes to it, right? And so I think we have to prepare our kids that this is a possibility, that the marriage, inshallah, if we do everything right, the chances are very good. But there's always, right, like, possibilities for things to not work out as we thought they would, and we have to really be willing to accept that, right, as part of the divine plan, right, and just sit with that for a little while and realize that there's other options for us if it goes this way, and we have to be okay with that.
Yeah. So what you said, Rana, just reminded me of the second episode of season 2. I'd invited a Muslim therapist, and we were discussing the importance of premarital counseling. And along that journey of that conversation, she had mentioned that just because Allah destined for you to be married to person X, it doesn't necessarily mean you're bound and tied together forever.
Sure.
Because now you close the doors that even if there's literally hell in the home, you close the door of divorce or seeking what Allah has placed for you on the other side of the door, right?
Of course.
Because of your mindset. So that's what reminded me.
Ascent, yeah. And of course, like I said, we have examples of this, and so, the need to rely on, people in those circumstances can always go back to those examples and kind of rely on that. But I do want to go back to your earlier question about how we can ensure our marriages are strong, right?
Yes.
A couple other points I'd like to share, right? That I think, another problem that we have is that in the modern kind of society that we live in, because our social institutions, right, our religious institutions are degraded, the family institutions have been degraded, right? Just communal institutions in general. Like we're living very atomized lives, which is like very individualistic kind of lives, right? And the phone is a primary example. It's called an iPhone, right? Because it refers to me. I. You have your own phone, she has her own phone, right? So before like 10 years ago or 20 years ago, if someone called my house to talk to my wife, well, first I would talk to them. But at least I would know who it was, or something called my children, right? I would know who it was, and I could talk to them for a minute or something, say salam, dua. Or likewise, if somone had called for me and my wife answered, she would at least know who it was, exchange salams to them. Right? Like there was more of a communal feel.
Village mindset is gone.
Correct. Yeah, and it's getting narrower and narrower as we go along, right? And so what I think has happened is that because of the breakdown of communal life, there has been a lot. There's been a lot of pressure put on the marriage, right? So what I mean by that is that now this marital bond is expected to fulfill a lot of roles in a person's life, right? So, for example, their friendships, right? Obviously, intimacy is one thing that's part of a marriage. But for example, your social life, right? Well, because we're living such individualized lives, and let's say each family is now in their own kind of cocoon in their house, right? Now there's an expectation that your best friend will be your wife or your husband, which in traditional society was not necessarily the case, right? You had so many more people to be able to connect with, and you would see them enough that they could be your best friends. Well, now you don't really see that many people during your day, unless you're in certain professions. But for those of us who are sitting behind a computer screen, the most human interaction we probably get with is their spouse. And so because of that, there's a lot of pressure on your wife, for example, to be your best friend, to be your counselor, right? To be your therapist, to be, financial support for you. We've put all these roles on one person, right? And that is a product of modern society. Whereas in traditional societies, those roles were spread out. And as you had more extended family networks as well, that support, right? Child rearing, for example, was something that was a communal task of community, right?
Even the tarbiyah,
the tarbiyah, the extended family. Well, now it's just the husband and wife. Well, guess what? If they're not able to properly do the tarbiyah, who is going to suffer? The husband and wife's relationship will suffer, right? So, because it'll lead to discord.
And that is such an immense pressure to put on ourselves when Allah, intended for the whole ummah to help one another.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And we're not, this is a very unnatural way of living, so to speak, right? Just by ourselves or just with one other person, such that, nobody else is really involved in our lives. And I think Muslims are subject, to that. We've adopted that mindset as well, where it's very personal if someone tries to help our kid do tarbiyah. Maybe thinks our kid did something wrong. We take it, very many parents are very defensive. Right? I work in a public school setting, so I see that a lot of times parents can be very defensive of their children, and even though the child is going to Islamic school, they may think that, well, my child did not do this or would not get in trouble, right? And obviously, like, people can make mistakes, but we should have this mentality that other people are also raising my child. Right? The second point I want to make is that in terms of how we can kind of fortify our marriages, one is that we have to realize that, so just to summarize this point, we have to realize that not all of our needs will be fulfilled by this one person, and nor should they be, right? And if we have that expectation that this person will fulfill all my social, emotional, spiritual, intimacy needs just in this one person, well, we're putting an immense amount of pressure on that person, right? So we need to also realize that we have to strengthen relationships outside the marriage, with our extended family, with our friends, right? Your wife does not need to, you don't need to put all the pressure on her or on your husband, right? And so that's an advice for women also, that they need to be able to have good, close relationships with other women, so that, it's not all the emotional pressure, psychological pressure is coming back to your husband. Right? So that's one point. But the second point I'd like to make is that, again, looking at the modern paradigm of marriage, we think of marriage as, happily ever after, and like your goal is to love and be happy. And if you set that as a goal, that's such a intangible thing, right? To say well, I want to be happy and to love you and feel loved, right? And of course, love is a real thing and we experience it, and it is a good thing and we want it. But again, sometimes if we just focus on happiness, like in the marriage itself, between myself and this person, it's kind of looking in the wrong direction. Meaning, like, it's better if you and your spouse sometimes are, instead of looking at each other, you're looking side by side in the same direction at a common goal. And so what that means is that if you are able to find certain goals that are shared for both of you, and then you're able to work on them together, right? Hand in hand. Well, that's now taking the pressure away from you guys looking at each other and putting it on that goal. And now what that does is, number one, it takes you outside of yourself, right? And outside of the marriage, to say that there's some third thing, right? Whether, for example, if I work at Al-Hadi, let's say I want my wife and I have this goal of, for example, right, making Al-Hadi the best Shia school in the country, right? Best Islamic school in the country. And so we're both working on that. Well, now we've kind of stepped out of our marriage a little bit, right? And we're both focused on this, right?
Yeah.
And so we're both like, that is more of our concern. So I won't get maybe as upset if, okay, my wife didn't do this or I didn't do something for my wife. Yeah, I mean, it's annoying.
You have that vision, you focus on the bigger picture.
Right, so you overlook the smaller things, right?
Yes.
And then I think having that also allows you to build those character traits that you need for the marriage to survive, right? When I have this goal outside of myself that I want Al-Hadi to be like this, well, that's going to take me to gain knowledge. That's going to require me to be a better planner. It's going to require me to be, relationships. And so as I build those skills, well, that also helps in my marriage, right? The knowledge and the relationships and all those things. So it's all,
I love it.
right?
Yeah.
I think really working on shared goals. And that's why I was actually thinking of you, because I know you noticed you mentioned your wife and she helps with the decorations and kind of work. It sounds like it's almost a shared project doing these podcasts, right? So that's really nice, right? That's a beautiful example of this. It's like where you both kind of have a goal you're working towards and, you'd like to achieve, and she does a certain thing and you do your part and you work together on this, and it's something meaningful for both of you. Right?
But I still have to charge her for
you do have to charge her,
right?
Inshallah.
We can do that, right?
You can.
Okay.
Yes.
Just kidding. Now, you mentioned this is like beyond my expectations, honestly. I already knew you're a wise Muslim, mashallah, may Allah bless you. But the gems you're dropping today, mashallah, it's beyond my expectations. Thank you. I'm learning so much from you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for
I just
coming.
try to share what I've learned from
Ahsant.
Ahl Bayt and then also my own teachers over time, and
Ahsant.
what has made sense to me,
Right.
as I've been a married person as well, kind of
Sure.
as I've gone through my own challenges. Like I think these really resonate with me.
Ahsant, yes, I can see. I can feel it.
Yeah.
Yeah. You did mention the word intimacy a couple of times.
Sure.
I noticed that. And now we're going to go at taboo topic inside a taboo topic. So, in the Muslim world, men are not affectionate. Or actually, let me rephrase that. In my culture, Somali, men aren't as affectionate physically, right? Even I remember my father, if I could quote him, when he was explaining love to me one time, he said, because we have an older sister, right? And he said that I show love to you differently than I show to your sister. In marriages, often for the intimacy, it means different things for men and women, right? So if there is lack of intimacy, right, in that department, in the Muslim world, there is a solution for the men. There's options for them available. They can get another wife or whatever the case may be via temporary or permanent basis. For the woman, if she's having that problem, she can't just say, okay, I'm going to get my second husband. No. How do we reconcile this very deeply painful problem that's really not uncommon in the Muslim world?
On behalf of the women, you're saying?
Correct.
Okay.
How do we address these needs for them?
Yeah.
For them, I mean.
Yeah. So definitely going further and further on the taboo chain.
Yeah.
Right?
Because it's one of those things that could definitely lead to divorce.
Of course. Yes.
Right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So very good question, right? So I mean, like as a starting point, within Shia fiqh, like the woman also does have certain conjugal rights, right? And the standard, the classical standard for that is once every 4 months,
Okay.
a woman at the minimum,
Sure.
right, is permitted or the husband has to offer. And now my mind is slipping as to whether it's 3 or 4, but I believe it's 4.
4 months.
4 months, yes. So the man has to agree to intimacy at a minimum of that. Of course, that is a long period of time, and that could be, perhaps too long for many women. But I just want to put that out there as a baseline, fiqh perspective, baseline minimum. But in terms of the lack of intimacy, of course, you're right. Not permitted for a woman to go outside the marriage, and also I don't think a man should consider that as his first option, right? So, that's not the right way to approach it. If you're having marital difficulties, is to just say, "Well, let me get a second wife," right? That's kind of making a joke out of that as well. Sure. But in terms of if a woman were to really have this issue, I think. Oftentimes it's rooted in a lack of, and maybe there are some biological concerns, and I can't really speak to that. I'm not an expert. And if the husband does have, biologically doesn't have as strong desires, then perhaps it's a different issue that I'm not really qualified to speak on. But generally I find that, in my experience, when these issues are happening, it's because of a breakdown in the emotional relationship first, right? Okay. Or because the intimacy follows that. Right? Yes, exactly. And so if a woman is having trouble having intimacy with her husband, well, there's something else going on there, right? Yes. Emotionally for the man. Right? If she wants to be more intimate and he's kind of pulling back or he's not as interested, there's something there. There's an underlying cause. There's a tension, right? It might be stress, it might be work-related stress, but it also might be something relating to the relationship, right? And so if she and him are willing to sit down and try to be honest about what that is and be willing to listen, right? Just with a lens of there's nothing wrong with you or I, but just there's an aspect of this relationship that's just not jiving right now. Sure. What is that? What is really bothering you, right? What is bothering me in this relationship, and how can we kind of at least come to a temporary solution, right? And it doesn't have to be. A lot of times that will involve compromise, right? Maybe with intimacy, she prefers something one way, he prefers something another way. Just have to compromise. Sure. You have to say that different times, different, ways of being intimate, for example, right? But really, I think in that situation, as a first step, right, a woman in that situation could really just sit down with her husband and just be honest with him about the problem, and just try to find out what it is that is disconnecting him from her, and try to find out what is it. Is it her? Is it something outside of the relationship? Right, that is causing him stress, right? Because it may very well be some other stress he's facing that is then coming out in the marriage, right? If that doesn't work, right, I do think that if this is becoming a serious problem, especially for the women in the relationship, then they do need to convince their husband to seek counseling, right? And whether that be with a religious scholar or a marriage counselor, that this is something that is an important aspect of marriage. And if the husband is really, really not able to fulfill that, and it's really a problem for the woman, then she should try her best to convince him to seek counseling on this area. Another example. Right? And the husband should, again, and this is where sincerity and taqwa comes in. If the husband is sincere and he's muttaqi, then he also needs to realize, okay, maybe I do need to go through this process. He shouldn't have so much pride that I'm not going to counseling, I'm not sitting in front of the Maulana. Well, if you don't want to go to the Maulana, then go to the marriage counselor. Sit with them and kind of try to talk through what is really going on here. Because I think underlying that distance physically is an emotional issue. Now, before I ask this next question, I do want to clarify, give a disclaimer, because a lot of these questions is coming from the angle of defending women. I do want to go on record and say I'm not a feminist, never have subscribed to that, and never will, because I have Islam, alhamdulillah. But that said, Muslims are not immune from oppressing women in some parts, in a lot of circles in the Muslim world, and financial is definitely one of those struggles. So, Sayyidina, I guess my question is, in Islam, we are the qawwam, we are the providers, right? The protectors of our family, the head, the leaders, right? And one of our, even if Allah hadn't given us that role, I think just as within our fitrah, we take pride in providing for our family, taking care of our family, right? Sure. Making sure our wives are happy, our children are well taken care of. But when
life doesn't go as planned, right? And divorce happens, or Allah takes the man back to him sooner than the wife hoped for, and now she has no husband. What programs or initiatives can we do to help our Muslim sisters who go through divorce or death of their husband and now are financially crippled because of the role that the man had? Maybe someone, she was a stay-at-home mom, right? She didn't work, and now to go back into the workforce, to polish up a resume, all of these small logistics go into play. It can become burdensome for her to make finances, to take care of the family, right? So how can we, as a one ummah, as our Prophet said that we are, come together and help ladies who are divorced and going through those situations where their husbands are no longer living?
Yeah, very good. Yeah, I mean, this is also a very difficult question, right? I think one thing to clarify is that, in an ideal Islamic system, right, there would be some mechanism, centralized, exactly, either Beit al-Mal or something at the centralized governmental level that would be taking care of these, for example, widows or divorcees who are not able to care for themselves or don't have other sources of support, right? So ultimately, we don't have that here, right? We're not living in that society, but if that were there, then that would be one way to handle this. I think, in addition, what we can say here is that, you raise a very good point, because although the woman can go back and maybe work, for example, in the modern world, where it's easier for women to be able to find jobs, living in the West as opposed to the East, right? To be able to support themselves, right? It's a little bit easier, but that also has negative repercussions, which is that, well, if the husband is out of the picture now, and the wife or the mother of the children now also has to go work, well, guess what? Now the children have neither mother nor father kind of present, right?
That's tough.
And so maybe that's also not a solution. That's not the best solution for the woman, for us to say, well, the woman should just find a job. Well, she can to support herself, but then someone's still suffering.
Yeah.
So there's no easy answer for that, right? There's no easy answer. I think it's important for, the woman to, not sure for everyone, but one of the beauties of, the teaching of Silat al-Rahim and keeping those familial bonds is so that a woman, in this case, will have people who look out for her. And even if that weren't there, as you said, that her family will still want to kind of provide for her and help her financially to the extent that they can, right? And they should be actually willing to do that for a relative Islamically who is in need. That is their obligation to do that. So I think all of these teachings of Islam can fit together and help. But from a communal and masjid level, of course, I think we do need to do more. We need to have some programs in place financially to help these widows and divorcees kind of stand on their feet until they're in a position to get remarried, for example. That may take several years.
Sure.
Right? But just so the children don't suffer too much.
Wow. I didn't even look at it from that perspective, because we live in a country that promotes this individualistic, right?
Yeah.
And where the communal, the village is kind of just slowly pushed back into the background, but you don't even realize now it's just you and this man.
Yeah.
And then God forbid something happens to this man, now you're trapped so lonely. Where Islam, if I understand it correctly, you can correct me and say that, as prevention is better than cure. So if you build this community from the beginning, from the ground up, now you have pillars to lean on, even if you get divorced or your husband dies or something.
Yeah, so if you build those relationships and you focus on them, then in your time of need, they will naturally just help. Right? So, but if you've just isolated yourself from the community, well, nobody's even going to know, maybe,
that's really good,
Right,
so a lot of these stuff is easier said than done, and it's all in theory, but
of course.
inshallah we can.
It's hard, right? With the distances that we live in, and the hours that we have to work, and hours that kids will have, right?
Oof.
All these challenges we're facing on a structural level, right? And so that's why I think the system, right, more so than my individual iman or piety, your individual iman is the system, right? That system of wilaya, governance, or just leadership or community that we have. If that is in place that can solve so many problems, right?
Yeah.
But then once we become disconnected from each other and we start thinking in our own silos, it's so much harder.
I'm laughing because it reminds me of my manager used to tell me, because I come from a sales background, right? And
I can tell. Very good.
thank you.
Sales pitch.
And he would often remind me, Abu, focus on the system. Don't do it your way.
I see.
Follow the system. Follow the system.
I see.
It's proven to work. You're going to get the sales down. Just stick to it. And I don't know. I just have a natural, I don't know if it's natural, but I just have a way of deviating from whatever system that's there. I'd like to just do things my way. And he would just remind me, no, come back. Follow the system.
Yes. That's funny.
SubhanAllah.
Yeah, so I mean, we need to have attention, right? So like Al-Hadi School is one example of that.
Yeah.
Right? Is that we have a fortress, right? Like a place that is our school that like we can be free in. We have, soccer, basketball, different things that we can organize there
Yeah.
on a communal level. And those things fulfill so many needs in so many different ways. Whether it's like socialization, exercise, meeting people for marriage, right? Like learning your religious obligations, all these things can happen if your centralized institutions are good, if they're strong, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as a community, we really need to kind of put a lot of our focus on building those institutions. And then that shows us the flip side, which is that like we really need to think twice about weakening these institutions, right? That there are sometimes people go to extremes and they do something to damage the overall community and the institution that we have that has ripple effects that are beyond just that.
Now, I don't want to end this episode without obviously honoring the very man that brought us here today, and that's the love of Imam Hassan alayhi salam. What can you tell us about the life of Imam Hassan? Like what moments maybe that, as soon as you think of Imam Hassan, that's the one moment that comes to your mind, or like favorite hadiths or something about Imam Hassan?
Yeah, so Imam Hassan is the things that, of course he's known as like the quiet Imam, as you said, because of this, the peace treaty with Muawiyah,
yes,
right? For example,
yes,
and not fighting, which of course, in some circumstances, is the right decision, right? So we have this narrow-minded approach sometimes to say like, okay, well, we always have to be on the path of Hussein. Oh no, like we have other Imams, other examples, and of course, Imam Hussein did the right thing, right? And we honor him and we love that. And that example was so much, so emotionally powerful, right? But we have the example of Imam Hassan that comes to mind. But the things that about his character that come to mind, one was these narrations that we have about him giving away his entire wealth, right, twice. That to me, just his generosity is something that I think is very powerful for me because it's very difficult for people to part with their physical wealth.
Yeah.
Right? And so especially fi sabilillah to give it, right? And then secondly, it's narrated that there's narrations, according to some narrations, he had gone to Hajj 25 times in his life. Now, given he was in Medina, so it was much closer, right? So it's not like us coming from the West. However, some of the narrations indicate that he also went barefoot, right? That he wanted to go barefoot and have his camels walk behind him, right?
Is there a reason for that? Or?
Apparently just, my understanding is as an act of humility, right? That I'm not even wearing my shoes. He would walk towards, the house of God and, I think if you just picturing that image in one's mind and realizing that as an Imam and Masum and all his qualities and characteristics, leader of the Ummah, doing this, it gives a lot of kind of calm and, joy to the soul to think about your Imam is like this.
Yeah.
Right? So, so those are two things that when I think of Imam Hassan that come to my mind.
Thank you. That concludes our episode for today. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. But you're not off the hook yet. I have one last question for you. What is your message to humanity?
So now you left the hardest question for me.
Yes. That question is never sent out.
That question is not sent. My message to humanity is that, as we look at what's happening around the world, right? In Palestine and different places, we see two things. One is a movement towards justice, right? We see that especially in the young people, regardless of where they are, right? They are more and more attracted to this idea of justice, that there needs to be justice in the world, both for ourselves and for the oppressed peoples, right? And the world is moving in that direction. And my message is that we need to get ourselves onto that ship as well, if we're not on it right now, right? We personally, as a community, as a city, as a nation, right, need to be on that ship. And the second thing is that humanity is increasingly interested in spirituality, and they've realized that this modern life that we have constructed for ourselves is not the way that we are supposed to be living, and that there are so many people throughout the world who are kind of fed up with this lifestyle, and it does not sit well with them because it is not natural to them. And people are waking up to that, and waking up to the need for really strong community bonds, strong relationships, and spirituality and religion in their lives. And we as a community also need to wake up to that, right, and realize that this is a direction that a lot of the world is heading, right, towards more integration, more less isolation, right, more communalism, less individualism, right, more faith and piety, less materialism, right, and so that is something that that is a second thing that I think humanity is trending in that direction, and as mu'mineen, we need to also align ourselves with that ship before it's too late.
Inshallah, may Allah give us the tawfiq to align ourselves with that shape, inshallah, with Muhammad and Al Muhammad. Allahumma ameen. So that's the end of for us here today. Join us next time. Until then, I'm your host, King Abu, saying goodbye, and remember to treat each other with kindness. Thank you.